Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, I want to thank the Minister for his assurance in the House that the two instances that I mentioned, people that might be going to protect their families against ISIS, they might be under siege in Kobani on the Turkish border, or people going to fight for the Free Syrian Army for a democratic and for a free Syria that respects human rights. But I've got to say, Minister, I've got the Minister's quote from Q&A, so perhaps if I can get the Minister's attention and get him to listen to this, because it seems to contradict the assurance that he's just given us in the House. This is a quote, presuming that the New Zealand Herald is quoting him accurately, from Q&A. We do, quote, this is Mr Finlayson, we do not want any New Zealanders getting caught up in this mess in the Middle East, whether they go off and want to fight for the Kurds or want to fight for ISIS. Now, the point that I just made to the Minister was that if I was a Kurdish refugee living in New Zealand and I was watching the slaughter of my people in Syria, I might be just inclined, if I was of that age, to want to go and support my family there. The fundamental thing that the Minister has the right to object to, I think, is somebody going to fight for a designated terrorist organisation that is doing acts against humanity, committing war crimes. I understand that. UN Security Council Resolution 2178 says that we should take steps, every step that we can, to prevent that happening. I am really worried, however, if we go beyond that resolution. That resolution was supposedly the resolution that led one of the reasons for the urgency of this legislation. But fundamentally, I believe that a New Zealander has the fundamental right to travel other than in that very narrow band of circumstances where they are going to aid and abet the commission of war crimes. Yes, of course we should stop that. We're obliged to internationally, we're obliged to under responsibility to protect, we're obliged to in all humanity. But the Minister's comments and the comments that he made in the House on his second reading, and I wrote down what he said, the main point is we do not want New Zealanders getting involved. Now, it might not be sensible for a New Zealander to go and fight in Kobani. They're putting their life at risk. But they might believe fundamentally that that is the right thing to do to protect their people, their families and their homes. And I don't think this House has any place stopping somebody going to engage in a conflict for those reasons. Some years ago, I passed legislation in this House that stopped mercenary fighters. That's where you go overseas to kill somebody for money. And I believe that it is equally justifiable to withhold the ability of a person to travel under the Passports Act to do that or to commit crimes against humanity. But my father's generation contained people who proudly went to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. And we are proud of the people that did that. And I would not want to see this legislation in the 21st century preventing what a former generation did, which was to fight for democracy and for human rights against oppression, as against the legislation here, which quite properly would prevent them fighting for a terrorist organisation committing crimes against humanity. And the legislation obviously takes its definition from the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002. And I regret that there was an amendment to that, I think around 2007, which means that all sorts of things could be defined as terrorism. You could define going to fight against apartheid and for Nelson Mandela as terrorism. And is it really what we would want to have in our legislation that we could interpret it as being to prevent that sort of thing happening? So I do seek a clearer definition from the Minister as to when these amendments to the Passport Act might be invoked and when they would not be invoked, because clearly officials gave me the assurance that they would not be invoked in the two cases that I mentioned to the Minister not so long ago. I want to just make a couple of other quick points about the passports legislation. I understand that there may be a reason to need to temporarily suspend a passport, as is done under the first part, for 10 days if you think a person might be doing going to fight for a designated terrorist organisation, and you want to stop that person. Mr Chairman?
The Honourable Phil Goff.
I have no particular problem with that clause. I welcome clarification of another point, and it was a point that many submitters came to the Select Committee on, and they said, you are clarifying the right to take away a passport from a person who is already overseas. This will render people stateless, and this will prevent them coming home, and the best way to help a terrorist organisation is to not give a person that might have been led into contributing to ISIS not to be able to come home and escape from that. And I think the explanation was a good explanation, that this does not render people stateless, it does not affect their citizenship, and that the minister must, and the words of the legislation are must provide a journey-specific emergency travel document for them to get home. So I have no problem with those two aspects of the changes to the Passport Act. The problem that I and my colleagues in the opposition parties had a problem with was the concept that we needed to withdraw a passport for 3 years. And this was a problem that the New Zealand Law Society, with its submission led by Sir Geoffrey Palmer, also had a problem with. The point is this, Minister, that under the current Passports Act, you can already deny a person a passport for a year, and then you can renew it. And when I asked the question of officials, was there anybody who has been denied a passport, and it's a very small number of people, that are now pressing for judicial review or taking court action that might lead them to be able to regain their passport and go overseas? And the answer was no. Now, 3 years is a long period of time, and I would have thought that in legislation introduced under urgency and rushed through the House to deal with a specific problem would be limited to dealing with that problem. And the one point that we put to the government that was not accepted from the Labor Party was the issue of whether you actually needed to change that 3-year designated period. Under proper consideration and in the normal course of a bill going through scrutiny and analysis, you might be able to prove to me that that's a good thing. But what the Minister could not prove to me, Mr Mallard, nor could you, is that you needed to do this under urgency immediately in this piece of legislation. And I asked the question repeatedly, as did my colleagues, why is it needed to extend that period of denial of passport to 3 years in one go after the first year of denying the passport? Why can't that wait till a substantive review takes place and legislation comes into the House in the normal way, is considered before a select committee? Why do we have to do this now? Because there is no evidence that this is needed now and immediately and before that review takes place. I'd be grateful if the Minister could take another call and just answer those 2 points. One, why 3 years when there is no apparent need to do that urgently? And just to clarify, what he's quoted as saying on Q&A on TV1 and what he said to the House, because I'm still left in some doubt as to whether my constituents in the circumstances I've explained would actually be able to leave overseas given the transcript from what he said on Q&A.